So, Whitney, Can I Be Me, which is the latest documentary by Nick Broomfield about the life and death of Whitney Houston, who I saw him interviewed just recently on, I think it was Newsnight. And he was describing her as, a wonderful and talented person. And the first thing that struck me is just how sympathetic the documentary is. And if you know anything about Nick Broomfield's filmmaking, I mean, Nick Broomfield and I had a run in years and years ago about Kurt and Courtney. And when he was making things like Kurt and Courtney, he had this habit of putting himself into his documentaries a lot. He was the character who walked around with the boom microphone, so much so that he actually got a gig doing adverts. It was some car-related product or a tire or something, because he had become famous enough as the bloke who wanders around with the document, with the boom mic, to become a character, his own thing. And then he's now he's moved on from that, which I think is a good thing. So basically, this traces the story. Were you a big Whitney Houston fan?
No, I mean I quite like some of her stuff, but I wouldn't interviewed her once, which was interesting. But
Oh, right, okay.
I can take or leave most of her.
Okay, fine. Well,
honest.
I have to say I felt much the same way going in, and one of the first things to say about the documentary is you do come out thinking, wow, it seems like a really obvious thing to say. Wow, she really could sing. There really was genuine talent in there, which is quite extraordinary. So it traces her roots, growing up. Her mother, who was a very, very powerful singer, Dionne Warwick, was her Warwick. How do you pronounce it?
Well,
never quite certain, because Burt Bacharach says Warwick, doesn't he?
I'm quite happy to say Warwick, really.
Okay,
But
fine.
whether that is, I'm sure we'll stand corrected.
Okay, is her cousin. And the film deals with the sort of tension between, on the one hand, her streetwise roots, and then the fact that when she was picked up by a record company, that what they wanted to do was to sell her, and the documentary says this quite clearly, as a kind of princess figure, and to sell her to a very particular audience, to sell her to a pop audience, as opposed to coming from gospel and R&B background, which leads at one point to her getting booed by the crowd. I think it's at Soul Train, and becomes a sort of really big moment for her. And it then talks about how she then tries to redefine her image publicly, and all the time suffering from a sense of anxiety that she wasn't worthy of the kind of success that she was achieving. Amidst the wealth of archive footage, there's a lot of backstage footage from a documentary from a 90s tour, which apparently never been seen before, which was going to be a kind of fly-on-the-wall doc, which didn't come together, although the director of that doc gets a shared directorial credit with Nick Broomfield. And the film centrally focuses in on her relationship with very, very long-standing close friend and confidant Robin Crawford, and then what happens to that relationship when she finds and marries Bobby Brown, who became a very controversial figure in her life. Here's a clip.
Oh, yeah.
He loved her as herself. She could come off that stage and not have to be the person that everybody in the world expected her to be, or who they thought she was. He understood that part of her. He understood the pressures because he was Bobby Brown, He understood her pressures and he understood her pain. What do I think that Bobby and Whitney gave each other? Acceptance. Love. Because again, she absolutely loved him. They loved each other, but there was acceptance, for who they were.
So as you can hear from that, I mean, basically, it is a clearly affectionate piece of work by Nick Broomfield, who in the past hasn't perhaps been known. That's not perhaps the way you would necessarily think of his filmmaking style. The film obviously will walk to some extent in the shadow of Amy. And it's worth saying from the outset that it's not as good as Amy. And the reason is that because of the way that Asif Kapadia made Amy, and that extraordinary use of the lyrics on screen, that felt really like almost somebody's diary, somebody's innermost thoughts, because those lyrics were so expressive. And that film really, I mean, it's such a painful watch, and similarly, you've got the sense of what an incredible talent, what an extraordinary talent there was there, and I know a lot of people who saw Amy and were worried that it was exploitative, and I didn't think it was. Although I think there were moments in it in which they would be using paparazzi footage that obviously, very clearly get close to kind of crossing the line between, intrusion and privacy. But there was something about Amy that felt like it was really in the center of that story. This is much more like watching something which is very, very sad from a distance. There is a certain amount of analysis of how everything fell apart, and talking about tensions between people who were close to her, and the way in which the press picked on some and not others. And there is a very interesting interview with Whitney Houston's bodyguard, who says very clearly that at one point he wrote a letter, a legal letter, saying, look, this is happening, and you need to know that this is happening, and these things are bad, and they are going to end badly. And we see a very redacted version of that letter. And he then says that the way he was responded was he was told that his services weren't required anymore. And obviously, in terms of stories of fame and fortune and the rest of it, it is not an uncommon story that people fall apart when living their lives in the spotlight in that way. I have to say that I did go into it thinking I'm not quite sure what I'm going to get from this. And I did find it, firstly, and perhaps most importantly, because although the story it has a really tragic arc to it, but for me, as somebody who is ignorant of what it was that was so great about Whitney Houston, I did come out of it thinking, okay, I do get that. I do get that what she was doing really was remarkable. And there are people who were talking about the way in which she was singing and the way in which she was, interpreting those, about how important that was. And that wasn't something that I have to say I was fully across. So I don't think it's brilliant, but I think it's solid. And I think it's heartfelt, actually. I think it is a heartfelt piece.